welcome to the podcast Shedding Candlelight on Cryptids, Hauntings, Mythology, and more. If it is weird, we are talking about it. This is your host, Lee Donna, and today we are talking about a woman whose very name strikes fear into the hearts of not mankind, but of men and men alone. Because this woman, whose stare is as deadly as the venomous snakes coiled in her hair, has never, according to ancient accounts, turned a woman into stone. At present, the first known written record where Medusa is mentioned by name is in the epic poem Theogony, written by the Greek poet, farmer, singer, astronomer, and philosopher Hesiod. It is believed that Theogony was written sometime around 700 BC and that this work predates all other sources of Medusa lore. More notably, Hesiod himself is considered to be a major source of Greek mythology, with his writing said to be the origin stories for not only Medusa, but for Pandora, Prometheus, and the Golden Age. Being the earliest known source for these parts of Greek mythology, Hesiod is sometimes given credit for using his writing to unite the different ideas that could be found city to city, people group to people group about mythology. In other words, when people like Hesiod or his seafaring father traveled to different areas, they would hear about a god or a monster or even a hero, and they can liken those tales to stories from their own people groups and then merge those stories together into one glorious tale. So Hesiod wrote about these things, taking bits from here and pieces from there, creating stories of his own that were then popular enough to be retold and expanded upon by other writers, which is the normal way of things. I think it is also worth noting that as we travel from these earliest known writings toward present day, we see that writers in general become much more detailed in their accounts of gods, heroes, and monsters. When Hesiod first wrote Theogony, I'm not sure if he realized or even hoped to be fathering what would later become major parts of Greek mythology. But there was very clearly something about his writing that stuck with people. So I am going to give you mainly his version of Medusa, brief as it is, because I want to talk about where Hesiod might have gotten his inspiration for Medusa. To me, the Medusa precursors are interesting. And once you have that background, there's an overall greater respect placed on Medusa the Gorgon with the deadly stare. The Greeks had a belief that there was an enormous river that encircled the world. This river was called Oceanus, and Hesiod tells us that Medusa, the protector, the guardian, and some interpretations even call her the queen, lived beyond Oceanus, towards the lands where the clear-voiced nymphs of night resided. Medusa was the mortal daughter of the sea gods Ceto and Phorcys. But though Medusa was mortal, she had two immortal sisters, Xena the Mighty and Euryale the Wanderer. All three sisters, even the mortal Medusa, were Gorgons. Hesiod does not speak of their beauty or lack thereof. He simply says that in being mortal, Medusa suffered a woeful fate, aging alongside sisters who never grew old. Be that a truly woeful fate or not, Poseidon, the dark-haired one himself, found something appealing about the mortal Medusa. He lay her down in a soft meadow among the spring flowers and made love to her. Their union resulted in a pregnancy, and when Medusa was later beheaded from the stump of her neck, their children were born. The first being Pegasus, the winged horse, followed by Chrysaor, the giant who wielded a golden sword. Now, that is pretty much Hesiod's version of events, not quite the Clash of the Titans. So I know what all of you are thinking. What about the living snakes for hair and men turning to stone when they look at Medusa? All fair questions. So let's talk about the reason Hesiod did not go into detail about the physical appearances of any of the three Gorgon sisters. The term Gorgon was well known to the Greeks. In fact, many cultures, even outside and predating Greece, had versions of Gorgons. All of these Gorgons have snakes for hair or snakes in their hair and can turn people to stone with a single look. So, all Hesiod had to do was name Medusa and her sisters as Gorgons, and then everyone automatically knew all three sisters were born monsters who had living snakes for hair, and that gazing upon them was bad for your health. In later accounts, because Medusa is called mortal, people portray her as human, and then for one reason or another, she's cursed and turned into the Gorgon monster. However, again, according to Hesiod, who is the originator of her story, though Medusa was mortal, she was never human. She was born a Gorgon and therefore born a monster. The name Gorgon comes from an ancient Greek word that means grim or dreadful. And that ancient Greek word is derived from the same root as a Sanskrit word that refers to a guttural sound similar to that of a growling beast. The Sanskrit language originated in ancient India several centuries before any written reference to Medusa and her immortal Gorgon sisters. There is another Sanskrit word that you are probably familiar with if you are a yogi like me, or like I used to be before health and life sidelined me. This term is Kundalini, and it refers to a type of feminine spiritual energy that sits at the base of the human spine. The root word that makes up Kundalini translates to coiled snake. Keep all of this in the back of your mind because feminine monsters with hair made of living snakes predate all currently known writings from ancient Greece. When these monsters are referred to as Gorgons, it is implied that they will have a head full of snakes and be dreadful, fierce monsters. It can also be implied that looking upon them will turn you to stone because petrification is another ancient concept that is woven throughout lore in many cultures. This month, I'm going to cover petrification in my Patreon episode because basically ancient people use this idea of people being turned into stone to explain their surroundings. Anything from mountains to stone circles were turned into cautionary tales and woven into myth. So I want to explore some of those with my patrons. Speaking of which, I want to give a shout out to Iceman888. You joined my Patreon in a way that I did not know was possible. And since I basically crawled out from under a rock when I started this podcast, it isn't saying too much when people do these seemingly simple things that amaze me. But Iceman888, while you were just out there living your life, doing your thing, you were teaching me something, and I am eternally grateful. So thank you. As for the Gorgons, they were seen as powerful monsters who struck fear into the hearts of men. So much so that ancient Greeks made statues of snake haired Gorgons and placed images of them on their buildings for protection. In a later retelling of Medusa's story, she's beheaded by Perseus, who eventually gives her head to the goddess Athena. The goddess then mounts Medusa's head on her shield for protection. This practice of having an item with a Gorgon head on it for protection resulted in said objects being considered amulets of a sort, and these protective items became known as Gorgonia, and they were thought to possess a type of magic that could turn away harm or evil influences, even the dreaded evil eye, which can kill you and is a whole episode all on its own. For the ancient Greeks, the most popular method of applying this protective magic was to engrave or draw a Gorgon face on pretty much anything and everything. Cups, vases, buildings, doors, tombstones. You could even find this Gorgon imagery near the threshold in mosaic floors. guarding buildings from intruders. People sewed the Gorgon onto their clothing and carved her into their weapons. 37 cities across the Mediterranean region, from modern day Tuscany to the coast of the Black Sea, which is about 2,000 kilometers or 1,250 miles on modern roads by car, minted coins featuring the Gorgon head. At the time, this would have made her image on coins more numerous than almost any other image. When portraying the Gorgon, it was almost always only a head. A female one with snakes in place of hair, big, wild eyes, fangs that resembled large tusks, and a tongue sticking out between those fangs. On occasion, there is blood depicted as dripping from underneath this head, and some suggest that instead of blood, these markings represent that the snake-headed, fanged woman has wings. In addition to using this Medusa-like image on nearly everything, it was also common for ancient people to then create a story surrounding how the Gorgon on their magical object died. A death that usually came at the hands of a hero, one who would capture the monster's head to inlay it into whatever item, because the head of the Gorgon retained the power of the Gorgon even after death. Images of the Gorgon dating back to the 15th century BC have been unearthed in Crete, and in her book, Language of the Goddess, Maria Gimbutas, I'm sure I did not say her name correctly, but she identifies the prototype of the Gorgoneion in Neolithic art, such as vases and terracotta masks inlaid with gold. At the Temple of Artemis in Corfu, which is a Greek island in the Ionian Sea, there are symbols of a Gorgon with not only a head full of snakes, but a belt made of snakes. In places like this, where a full-bodied Gorgon is depicted, it is often wearing a belt of two entwined snakes. It is said that these snakes represent the herald's wand. This wand or staff is carried by Hermes in Greek mythology, but many scholars believe this image is rooted in Mesopotamia and was originally connected to the Sumerian god Ninjashzida, the lord of vegetation and the underworld, because those two things go really nicely together. This Sumerian god was also closely associated with snakes and carried a staff or a wand. In the Gorgonian depictions, this herald's wand sometimes includes the addition of wings, giving it a distinction from the rod of the Greek god of medicine, Asclepius, which has only one snake and no wings. It is this second rod that is widely used in the medical field, though some healthcare organizations do prefer to use what I am now going to call Medusa's wand, with two snakes and wings. Medusa really does not have a very good story, so she deserves wings. And because of how far back we can trace these Gorgon images and how there are fangs and later obliterations of Medusa's character, along with exploitations of her sexuality, I can't help but to think of comparisons to our vampiric winged Lilith demon. Whether there is any connection between them or not, what we do know is that in temples with markings such as those found on the Greek island of Corfu, it is believed that a priestess would be there acting as an oracle, delivering news of fate to those who dared to seek her out. Because of masks found in areas with these temples, it is also believed that the priestess would wear the face of the snake-headed Gorgon while conducting their duties that some believe are a continuation of traditions that started in Egypt, where people worshipped a snake goddess called Wajet. Images of Wajet depict her as a cobra-headed woman. In some of the images, she literally has the head of a cobra in place of a human head. In others, she looks exactly like the images we have of Medusa, a woman with snakes for hair. Wajet is also a protector, the same as Medusa, and her image was used in much the same way as the Gorgon, becoming a protective emblem. In Wajet's case, her image has been found on the crowns of pharaohs. Wajet could spit fire, and she was referred to as one of the eyes of the sun god Ra. The other eye was often depicted as being Sekhmet, another goddess who could breathe fire. Sekhmet is often depicted as having a lion's head, and interestingly, the oldest oracles were said to be protected by, drum roll please, serpents. Serpents whose image was usually depicted as a Gorgon head, with the Gorgons in Egypt being associated with lions, sphinxes, and temples where either Wajet or Sekhmet were worshipped. I do believe that means Medusa should rightfully be called the queen, but to deepen the roots of her true origin story, I want to touch on a couple more connections to Egypt and other lands of influence on Greek culture. For starters, another Egyptian deity named Neith is considered by some to be a precursor to the Greek goddess Athena. Athena is woven into Medusa's story in various formats, depending on who is doing the telling. Furthermore, Neith is said to be the personification of primordial waters, and Medusa's parents are primordial sea gods. Neith is also considered to be the virgin mother of the sun god Ra, and she is often depicted as wearing a crown bearing a cobra, the sign of the goddess Wajet. It is said that Neith was called Athena in Greece after the Greeks occupied ancient Egypt, and that Neith's story came to the Greeks by way of ancient Libya, which borders Egypt. Writers after Hesiod claimed that the place beyond Oceanus where Medusa and her sisters lived was Libya. Therefore, Perseus brought the head of Medusa to Greece from Libya, spilling drops of blood from her severed head along the way, each of those drops hitting the ground and turning into snakes, which is why, to this day, Libya is rich in snakes. In Libya, they worshipped a serpent goddess who represented female wisdom, a goddess associated with the destructive power of Neith, who was considered to be the oldest of all other ancient Egyptian deities. From Neith, the world was born. She was the goddess of creation, said to reweave the world on her loom daily. From her primordial waters, she brought forth the first land and conceived within her heart 30 children to be the gods of Egypt and all that is. Neith is said to have been born at a time when there was yet no birth. An inscription in a temple dedicated to her reads, I am the things that are, that will be, and that have been. No one has ever laid open the garment by which I am concealed. The fruit which I brought forth was the sun. The line that says, no one has ever laid open the garment by which I am concealed, refers to a veil that Neith is said to have worn because, like Medusa, if anyone looked directly at Neith, they would die. Some sources say people turned to stone if they looked at Neith, and others say that her blood created life, like how Medusa's blood created snakes. There are other Gorgon stories outside of Medusa that make references to Gorgon blood being able to both create and take life. I would say this means that in some form, the concept of the Gorgon was born from the story of the creation goddess Neith. And if you are sticking with me, let's take this one little step further. On the wealthy and ahead of its time Greek island of Samos, where the philosopher and mathematician Pythagoras, father of the Pythagorean theory, was born, and where an astronomer whose name I cannot pronounce was the first to conclude that the earth revolved around the sun loosely being Neith's child, if you believe that from her the world was born. On this island of Samos, there is an inscription that speaks of a gorgia, which is an underground chamber, and it's paired with a word that means golden. The interpretation then means that there is an underground chamber of gold associated with the Gorgon. Circling back to Sanskrit, where I told you to remember that tidbit because it's probable that the word Gorgon came from the ancient Sanskrit language. There are creatures known as Nagas whose lore originates in Sanskrit. These are half human, half serpent beings that live underground or in bodies of water. They are often depicted with a cobra hood behind their heads, are said to have the power to spit fire, are endowed with magic, and guard treasure. So the next time you hear of Medusa being relegated to someone's narrative of seduction, feminine rage, destructive beauty, rape culture, fear of powerful women, fear of being willing to look truth directly in the eye, and all the other many appropriations, stop and think about these origins because Medusa's story goes well beyond all of that. Medusa isn't only fear itself or a symbol of terror, power. She is all of these things. And quite possibly, she whose radiance is so great that she cannot be looked upon is the source of life itself. No matter her narrative, whether she be the embodiment of beauty or grotesquely hideous, all of mankind should respect her because Medusa, the Gorgon, is a queen. All of mankind should also subscribe to the show because if you did not notice, I just updated my podcast logo and it has a little bit of an evil eye on it. I didn't go full Gorgon, turn you to stone if you don't subscribe, but still, just to be safe, you better hit those like buttons, subscribe, and send your comments, stories, and show ideas to me at leadonabooks@gmail.com. You can follow me on the social media platforms that I regularly ignore, and you can find my books at leadonabooks.com and or on patreon.com/LeeDonna. Thank you so much for being with me today. I appreciate each and every one of you. So please do not go looking snake-headed queens in the eye because I want to see you right back here next month as flesh and blood, not stone pillars.